Number 8. Melissa Goodwin. From November of 2019 to April of 2020, corrections officer Melissa Goodwin was involved in a romantic relationship with inmate Corey London at the Metropolitan Remand and Reception Centre in Sydney. Their tryst began shortly after London, who was serving time for armed robbery, had been transferred to the prison. The pair spoke on the phone via a third party and also secretly over the prison intercom. The extent of the physical exchanges between bodybuilding enthusiast Goodwin and the inmate remain unclear. 4 days after he was transferred from the prison where she worked, Goodwin wrote him a letter in purple, his favorite color. In it, she expressed her hopes for their future, but also wrote about the risks she was taking by getting involved with him. They maintained their relationship, but Goodwin then started seeing former inmate, aspiring rapper, and associate of the Rebels Motorcycle Club, Caleb Valeri. The budding romance gained media attention, and news of it reached 21-year-old London. He gave further evidence about their relationship while enraged during a phone conversation with his mother. Goodwin ultimately admitted that they'd been boyfriend and girlfriend, but claimed their exchanges were more on a pen pal level. She vehemently denied allegations that she'd performed explicit acts on him in a storeroom a total of 5 times, as London himself had stated earlier. However, when it came time to testify against his ex, London categorically refused to do so. Even with the risk of time added to his sentence, he cited a fear for his safety, presumably from members of the rebels. Since there was no conclusive proof that intercourse had occurred, Goodwin avoided jail time. She pled guilty to having a relationship with an inmate, and other allegations against her like smuggling tobacco, cigarette lighters and gum for London were dropped. She was given a 12-month community corrections order as well as 120 hours of community service. Number 7. Alex BANTA, TODD SCHEFFLER, and WILLIE HEDDEN. In May of 2018 at the Western Illinois Correctional Center in Mount Sterling, an inmate was severely beaten by 3 of the prison guards in what was subsequently deemed an unprovoked attack. 65-year-old Larry Irvin was airlifted from the prison with a punctured colon, broken ribs, and other serious internal injuries. He needed surgery to remove a section of his bowel in the aftermath of the attack. Irvin passed away several weeks after the incident, and his death was ruled a homicide from blunt force trauma. Guards Alex BANTA, TODD SCHEFFLER, and WILLIE HEDDEN were charged in the aftermath. They'd moved Irvin to a segregation unit where they brutally beat him while he was handcuffed behind the back and posed no threat to them. BANTA and SCHEFFLER pled not guilty to charges of conspiracy to deprive of civil rights, deprivation of civil rights, obstruction of an investigation, falsification of documents, and misleading conduct. 42-year-old HEDDEN entered a guilty plea and agreed to cooperate in exchange for lesser charges. Even so, the 2 counts of civil rights violations, which he admitted to, could see him sentenced to life in prison and fines of $250,000 each. The trial is ongoing. Number 6. Tina Gonzalez. In 2021, a former corrections officer at the Fresno County Jail in California was jailed for 7 months for engaging in an intimate relationship with an inmate. The identity of her lover wasn't released, while Assistant Sheriff Steve McComas, one of Gonzalez's superiors, described her actions as the product of a depraved mind. It was reported that the woman, who was in her mid-20s, cut a hole in her uniform so that it would be easier for her to have intercourse with an inmate, in full view of at least 11 other detainees. She had worked at the jail from 2016 to 2019, and following a tip, staff launched an investigation into her activity. In addition to being intimate with the inmate, she'd also endangered the lives of her colleagues by allegedly supplying him with razor blades, which can be used as a weapon in prison. Gonzalez had also provided him with a cell phone and informed him about cell inspections so that he could hide contraband. Even though she'd violated her oath and ruined her career, according to McComas, Gonzalez showed no remorse after being caught and continued to engage in explicit phone calls with the inmate, boasting about the crimes she'd carried out. Number 5. Erica Whittingham. In 2021, a former corrections officer was sentenced to 3 years in prison for getting involved with an inmate and helping him escape. Following the breakdown of her 11-year-long marriage, Erica Whittingham fell for violent robber Michael Sodden, her lawyer later arguing that she was smitten with him. Sodden was considered too dangerous for public release, having been sentenced as part of a gang that tied and beat up a 78-year-old man at his Dorset farm in 2011. Sodden and Whittingham met while she was a custody officer at HMP Dovegate in Staffordshire between 2017 and 2019. They developed a romantic relationship which continued even after Sodden was transferred to HMP Sudbury. To communicate, he used a contraband cell phone and she talked on a burner phone. On October 1st of 2019, Sodden escaped by scaling the prison's fence and then fleeing in the car that had been waiting for him, with Whittingham acting as the getaway driver. They remained in contact and met roughly 8 times in various areas of the country while Sodden was on the run, with Whittingham paying for hotels, accommodation, and other items that he needed while evading the authorities. Then from January to March of 2020, in the second part of his 6 months of freedom, Sodden started seeing another woman in the Bournemouth region. He was eventually arrested on March the 27th. Whittingham pled guilty to harboring an escaped prisoner and misconduct in public office, while Sodden had 6 months added to his sentence for the escape. Number 4. Gladiator fights at California State Prison. In 2019, relatives of inmates at the California State Prison in Corcoran protested outside the facility for the extensive violence that their loved ones were allegedly forced to face while incarcerated. The main aggressors were members of the Fresno Bulldogs, who'd failed to uphold a truce and started attacking their rivals in the yard roughly a year prior. This caused 350 inmates to be placed on a modified program that restricted visitations and exercise time. Inmates' rights organization, the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, alleged that the guards were putting on gladiator fights by purposefully releasing rival gang members in the yard at the same time. They anticipated that the groups would brawl and thus could use their fighting as a justification for the continuation of the modified program. One of the protesters, who hadn't seen her husband in months, argued that the guards liked to see bloodshed, while the state's Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation denied that guards were setting inmates up to brawl. There have been past reports of gladiator fights at Corcoran. In 2000, 8 guards were acquitted of similar charges after they'd been brought to trial in an FBI investigation. It was reported that they'd encourage prisoners to fight, only to sometimes end them by firing deadly shots. There were rumors of an extensive cover-up and silenced whistleblowers, but the acquittals were upheld. A few years prior, state legislative hearings underlined the brutality of Corcoran, while an independent panel found that nearly 80% of the shootings were unjustified occurrences which the state never fully investigated. Number 3. Tashina Majors. In 2020, a senior officer at Northern State Prison in Newark, New Jersey, was charged with second-degree assault for being romantically involved with an inmate. From November of 2019 to December of 2020, Tashina Majors had been bedding an inmate over whom, by virtue of her status, she had authority and disciplinary power. 42-year-old Majors' alleged misconduct was uncovered following a joint investigation by the Attorney General's Office of Public Integrity and Accountability and the New Jersey Department of Corrections Special Investigations Division. Majors had yet to comment on the allegations, but she took down her Facebook in the scandal's aftermath. If found guilty on the assault charge, she risked a fine of up to $150,000 as well as 5 to 10 years in a state prison. Today's topic was requested by Deb Pearson and the JMall88. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Ralph Keppler. In December of 2016, Teresa Keel was found nearly bludgeoned to death near her home in Long Beach, New York State. 56-year-old Keel had been repeatedly struck in the face with a metal barbell, which resulted in her losing an eye and suffering broken teeth, as well as a partially collapsed skull. Keel was left in a vegetative state due to irreparable brain damage and died roughly 2 years later. Whoever had brutally attacked her was effective in covering their tracks. Intense investigative work by Long Beach and Nassau County Police Departments ultimately pointed to Keel's own daughter, Francesca, and her boyfriend, Ralph Keppler, as the ones behind the murder. Keppler, a corrections officer at Rikers Island, and his family had invested in a dating app developed by Keel and her son. A business dispute had been suspected as the main reason behind the killing, with Keppler feeling that Keel had squandered his investment and demanding his money back. Francesca, then in her late teens, aided her boyfriend in carrying out the attack on her mother. She installed a GPS tracker on Keel's car with email alerts informing her when the vehicle was close to her home or workplace. KEPPLER stalked the woman and ambushed her in the entrance corridor to her apartment complex, unleashing the savage attack that eventually ended her life. Francesca called a taxi that picked KEPPLER up from the scene of the crime. The police arrested him at Rikers Island, where his employment was promptly terminated. He was sentenced to 22 years after pleading guilty to second-degree murder, second-degree conspiracy, and related charges, while Francesca entered a guilty plea for second-degree manslaughter and was given a 13-year sentence. Number 1. Nancy Gonzalez. In January of 2007, Ronell Wilson became the first man to be sentenced to death by a federal jury in New York since the capital punishment had been reinstated in 1988. During a gun deal gone wrong a few years prior, Wilson, an alleged member of the Stapleton Crew street gang, executed 2 undercover NYPD detectives, searched their bodies and stole their car. When his death sentence was pronounced, the victims' families and other members of the police force responded with applause and cheers, to which he reportedly reacted by sticking his tongue out at them. In 2010, his death sentence was vacated on appeal due to a legal technicality, and he was moved to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. It was there that in July of 2012 he had relations with prison guard Nancy Gonzalez, who was then in her late 20s. The consensual and illicit rendezvous had taken place in a staff bathroom. She became pregnant with Wilson's child and in 2013 gave birth to a son who they named Justice. After the tryst surfaced, Gonzalez lost the custody battle and the child was placed in foster care with her maternal aunt. At her trial, Gonzalez's defense lawyer argued that she'd been abused in her younger years and while serving in the military, which resulted in emotional instability, causing her to seek destructive relationships. She was reportedly involved with another inmate who wasn't named when she met Wilson. Gonzalez was ultimately sentenced to 1 year in prison. Prosecutors argued that Wilson had targeted and impregnated her in order to avoid ending up on death row again. He was nevertheless sentenced to death again before it was ultimately commuted to life without parole on the grounds that he was intellectually disabled, which made him ineligible for execution under the 8th Amendment. Thanks for watching. For a year, would you rather work in an overcrowded prison that's packed with violent offenders or live alone on a research station in Antarctica? Let us know in the comments section below.